Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi, as we know, is in Moscow at his much delayed summit meeting, a fact that he noted as he spoke addressing Vladimir Putin in a joint interaction, televised interaction, where he said that we are meeting after 2.5 years, so on and so forth. However, lots of substantive issues were raised and lots of important statements were made. Statements were made not just in terms of statements to the press, but also statements that India made to Russia or Prime Minister Modi made to Vladimir Putin. And these are very significant. And why we will talk about the nuances and complexities of the Prime Minister's statement in the presence of Vladimir Putin in some detail, and why we will take some time picking the nuances from the complexities of the very subtle and deft statement that the Prime Minister made in the presence of Vladimir Putin. Let me also tell you that there are also issues between India and Russia, particularly issues of some critical armament supplies, most important of which is the delayed supply of the S-400 batteries. That also I will come to towards the conclusion of this episode. So stay with me. I will give you some precise numbers and scheduling challenges there as well. Now, India-Russia relationship in any case is a very substantive relationship for India, for the rest of the world, but also for India. That is the reason we now have a second successive episode of Cut The Clutter on Narendra Modi's Moscow visit. The first one was yesterday, setting it up. That was 1476. This is the successive one. That's because important things have been said and done. Also, there will be a fair bit of, at least some bit of opinion in this one. So please be warned. In fact, I will get some of that opinion out of the way right away up front. And that is our 50-word edit on this visit. Please read this. It's on your screen. I will also read it out for you. It says, choosing Russia for Prime Minister Modi's first bilateral visit is a fine expression of strategic autonomy. Good point. In hard geopolitics, however, it's the tightest of tightrope walks. India aligned strategically with Washington and the West 3 decades ago. Modi's decade only accelerated this shift. This is a hell of a contradiction to manage. So that is the tightrope that Prime Minister Modi is walking in Moscow. And you can see some of that, in fact, a lot of that in what he said in Vladimir Putin's presence. He was speaking in Hindi. It was translated with breaks in Russian for Vladimir Putin. And see, I tried to read something on Vladimir Putin's face as Prime Minister Modi was saying these things to him. But to tell you the truth, I'm not a reader of faces. I'm not a trained reader of faces. But as a journalist who's dealt with a lot of people and who does try to read faces, at least journalistically, I found no emotion on Putin's face of any kind. In fact, the only thing I noticed was foot movement, as the Western press also keeps noticing all the time. Putin has a lot of foot movement at meetings. It's kind of nervous foot movement, more of his right foot. However, while we saw a lot of his right foot movement in this interaction, it's only when Prime Minister Modi said some of the tougher things about the death of children, innocent children and innocent people, that you suddenly saw the left foot also moving. So that is, if you are one of those who knows anything about body language, you can try and read Vladimir Putin's body language. I am sure there are lots of experts around the world, particularly in the Western world, who make their living trying to do just that, reading Vladimir Putin's body language. That's my little observation, but that's that aside. That is just an aside. What is it that Modi said? Modi said, first of all, he said that he was there after his unprecedented victory and thanked Putin for congratulating him on that victory. So no question that he He's telling the world that this is his third victory. It's unprecedented for anybody to get elected for a third time. Then he again congratulates Putin for his victory in the elections in March, such as the elections in Russia might be. I think he got some 88% or 90% votes, and that's when I had said that I'd like to see the 7-8% or 10% who did not vote for him. Who are those champions and what happened to them? That besides, he first talked about his own victory and thanked Putin for congratulating him, and congratulated Putin once again for his March victory. Then he said that in the past 40-50 years, it's a very significant statement up front. We are not going to Ukraine yet. He said for the past 40-50 years, India has been a victim of terrorism. And we know how painful terrorism is, particularly when you see people dying of terrorism, innocent people being hit by terrorism. It is very painful and very traumatic. And he said this in the context of terror attacks that Russia has been facing. So Moscow, we know that there was that big attack on a theater, and lately, more recently, there were attacks in Dagestan. Those Narendra Modi mentioned by way of sympathy, solidarity with Russia. Remember, both of these attacks involve Islamist groups. One clearly claimed by IS, in fact, both more or less claimed by ISIS proliferation. So that is the statement he made up front. It was like a statement of solidarity. He also said, in the past 10 years, you and I, that is Putin and Modi, have met 17 times, and in the past 25 years, 22 times. So even when Narendra Modi was Chief Minister of Gujarat, there were meetings. Then he says, this time we are meeting after 2.5 years. That's the reason I said up front that this is happening after a gap. And he says, already it's my 6th visit to Moscow. That shows the depth of our relationship. And then he says, I will say it unhesitatingly, that in this special relationship, you are the Sutradhar. You are the one who's made it possible and who's kept it going over 2 decades. For the simple reason, I'm adding that, for the simple reason that Putin has been the constant leader in Moscow for more than 2 decades now. That is not the kind of thing we've seen in India before. That's a very Russian phenomenon, and that's a very Putin phenomenon. So he's been the leader right through these 2 decades of this special strategic partnership and the series of summit meetings. There are supposed to be 2 summit meetings every year, as we had mentioned yesterday. Then after saying all the nice things, all the platitudes about looking forward to deepening this relationship, Prime Minister Modi sort of quite deftly shifts to what's happened to the world in the past 5 years. So he talks about COVID and he talks about the wars. So he said first, COVID gave trouble, caused trauma for the whole world, and then warfare broke out in many parts of the world, across the world, and that has led to tension, conflict, and in that situation, once again, very diplomatically brings in a compliment. He says that our friendship, which means India-Russia friendship, it has helped cushion the world from food, fuel, and fertilizer crisis, and he says that's where we in India particularly benefited from continued supply of fertilizers. India imports a lot of fertilizers from Russia, and also a lot of India's fertilizer plants depend on feedstock imports from Russia. And then he says, I look forward to further cooperation with Russia. And then again he begins to get to the business end a little bit. He says he thanks Putin for supplies of crude oil, which India buys in large amounts. I had mentioned to you, India-Russia trade now is nearly $66 billion, of which more than $60 billion is just India's oil imports. So effectively, India's trade deficit with Russia right now is $62 billion. So he talks about deepening that relationship, but he also mentions that this India-Russia relationship, or India's purchase of crude oil from Russia, has also helped bring stability in global fuel markets, and thereby it has indirectly benefited the entire world by way of keeping inflation in control. Then he gets closer to what I might describe as the business end of this of this talk, because he's talking not just to Putin and not just to his Indian audiences, but he's talking to the rest of the world, particularly the Western world, because there is a lot of skepticism in the Western world about India's special relationship with Moscow, India's oil purchases. We are all within the sanctions, within the law, so there is no violation of sanctions because these purchases at a certain floor price are allowed under the sanctions regime. That's not the issue, but generally the Western world, which is aligned with India, remember, India is a key partner of Quad, which is so important for Indian security as well. In the West, there is a lot of skepticism and criticism about India's relationship with Russia. And that is something that Modi needs to nuance. And this meeting or this statement came hours after this tweet written by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, where he spoke very critically of Narendra Modi hugging Vladimir Putin. And he said, and I quote from that tweet, although you will see the entire tweet run on your screen, it's a long tweet. This came after a children's hospital, in fact, Ukraine's largest children's hospital, was hit by Russian missiles and lots of people had died, including small children. Now, I will read for you the relevant para from this long tweet on the Modi visit to Moscow. It says, and I quote from Zelenskyy's tweet, "It is a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day." Just the timing was so terrible. Although when a war is going on, I don't know what's a better day, what's a worse day. There is no such thing as good timing. Every day is terrible timing. When a war is going on, a long, brutal war is going on. But this in particular, this missile hits on a children's hospital precisely almost to the hour that Modi landed in Moscow was seen to be quite triggering by the Western world, the Western media, particularly as these pictures, which you see on your screen, as these pictures of the Modi-Putin hug came out. Now, as you would expect, in the Western world, there is a lot of criticism of this hug. See this tweet by Derek Grossman. Now, the expectation is that even if Modi is meeting Putin, at least he'll not be seen to be hugging him in public. But you know what? Nations act in their own interest. I'm not giving you opinion. Nations act in their own interest. Nations don't act for charity, and foreign policy is not determined by morality. For too many decades, India's foreign policy was determined by morality. It did not bring that much benefit for India. So India was always anti-this, anti-that, anti-apartheid, anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-the Arab world, pro-the third world, member of non-aligned movement. All of that did very little to enhance India's interests or India's larger stature. So nations in their self-interest take calls which do not pass the test of morality. In fact, a good example of nations putting morality aside in their own larger interest is this famous or infamous, depending on which side you are on, fist bump between Joe Biden, the US president, and Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. That's when the Americans were fighting with the Saudis over columnist Khashoggi's assassination. So nations act like that, and that is how I would see this hug as well. But Zelenskyy is on his own side also. He's also a nation. He has to speak and act in his own interest. It was in that backdrop that Prime Minister Modi was addressing Putin today in Moscow. And it's important for us to note that point so we can better understand where Prime Minister Modi was coming from in the statements that he made subsequent to this. He said all of the world has always watched the India-Russia relationship very closely in the past 25 years, but this visit in particular is being watched very closely and subjected to varying interpretations. And then he said, "You called me home as a true friend, and we discussed Ukraine freely. We had a free and open-hearted exchange of thoughts on Ukraine with mutual respect for each other's views. We understand each other's respective views with respect, but we also spoke candidly, and I thank you for allowing that candid discussion." That's an important statement to make, because what that means is he's not expressing solidarity with the Russian position on Ukraine. If you translate this into simple English, it means that, look, I have disagreements with your policies in Ukraine or what you're doing with Ukraine or the war that you're waging on Ukraine. I said that to you. You let me say it without any rancor or bitterness. You gave me your reasons for invading Ukraine and carrying on with this war, which I also heard out without being judgmental about. So that is the translation of what Narendra Modi said. And then he says, we recently had the G20 summit in India, very important, where the global south, where India tried to emerge as the voice of the global south, and global south also has expectations of peace, which also I presented to you. Remember, at the G20, there was a joint declaration, which was an Indian achievement for sure, which mentioned Ukraine and the need for peace there. So he brings it there, and then he says some things in Hindi which are difficult to translate. So I will mention some words in Hindi, not the entire sentences, that will take too long. Some words in Hindi, and I will translate them for you. He said, Yudh, Sangharsh, Atankvad. Ye jab hota hai, when you have war, you have conflict, you have terrorism, then innocent people die. Particularly when innocent children die, तब हृदय छलनी छलनी हो जाता है. That really breaks your heart, right? Or this that punches so many holes through your heart. And he says it with a good expression on his face. And while he's saying this, watch Putin. This is the exact picture from that moment that I'm showing you on the screen. We'll also try and run that video on the side. There is no expression in Putin's face. Only his left foot also starts moving at this point, besides his right foot. So he says, मासूम बच्चों की जब ऐसे मृत्यु होती है तो हृदय छलनी छलनी हो जाता है. It breaks your heart when innocent children die. And इसके बारे में हमारी विस्तार से चर्चा हुई. And we discussed these issues also in detail. Here, he's addressing the Western audiences, and he's telling the Western audiences, his Western friends, India's Western friends, that look, I am somebody not from Russia's camp. I am not China, right? I'm not Iran. I'm not North Korea. I'm not from Russia's camp. I'm partners with the West in many areas, particularly the Quad. But I am still capable of saying these things to Putin in public and in Putin's presence. So wouldn't you rather have me here as this interlocutor for good sense than either have me hiding or boycotting Russia or joining your boycotts of Russia? Wouldn't you rather have me on the table? That is the message that's being sent here. And again the Prime Minister said, and I will repeat that one line in Hindi, युद्ध के मैदान में समाधान संभव नहीं है. युद्ध के मैदान में इन समस्याओं का समाधान संभव नहीं है. That you cannot find a solution to these complex problems in the battlefield. Bum, बंदूक और गोली, that is bombs, guns and bullets, cannot help find a resolution to these problems. These problems can be resolved only through talks, only through negotiations. And then he says it's a matter of satisfaction that these conversations took place in total candor without lipapoti. Now, how do I translate lipapoti? So I will do a best efforts translation without any window dressings. Without any window dressing, बिना किसी पर्दे के, without any curtains, which means without any hesitation. And then he says, through these candid discussions, many interesting ideas emerged, a new thinking emerged, and he's left it at that. There is no hint at what this new thinking might be. And then he goes on to add कि शांति की बहाली में भारत जो रोल अदा कर सकता है करेगा. That in the process of restoration of peace, India will play whatever role it's called upon to play. And he said that I want to reassure the world opinion that your talk, the talk with you, has comforted me. Once again, it's a hint that is pushing Putin towards a non-war resolution or a non-war solution to the issue. After this, there was a briefing by the Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra. He took some questions from journalists also. I will share a link of that with you with the description. I will also share with you a link of Prime Minister Modi's talk to Putin. That's very important. There is also Russian translation going on with this. And since we talked so much about body language and Putin's foot movement, you can also see it in that video. That said, what's happening between India and Russia on critical supplies? Now, Foreign Secretary in his briefing acknowledged that there are a couple of problems. One of the problems is the trade imbalance. The trade has now become so heavily loaded in favor of Russia because it's unidimensional. It is just oil, oil, oil. And while the two leaders set a target of $100 billion for 2030, Frankly, if it just goes on like this, even in terms of crude oil, it will get to $100 billion, except India's deficit then might be $94 billion from $62 billion right now. So the Foreign Secretary said the Prime Minister raised the issue of enlarging the trade basket and also for providing greater access to Indian goods in Russia. Also, there were talks about co-production of fertilizers in India with Russian investments. Now, obviously, with Russians sitting with so much surplus rupee, India has to find ways for that rupee to be spent. However, but the bigger problem, the Foreign Secretary said that there are issues with supplies of spares or resupply of spares for Russian and Soviet origin equipment. And he said that some solutions are being found or being considered, including joint production of these spares in India. But the most critical of all, the elephant in the room, is the S-400 supplies. Now, S-400 are the top of the line surface-to-air missile batteries that India had ordered with the Russians. It was a $5 billion plus order in 2019 when the order was first placed. So first, the deliveries were delayed a little bit because India was a little bit late in making the payments. Remember, there was a threat of sanctions from Washington, and that had to be dealt with quietly. Once that was dealt with, payments were made. The first batteries arrived in 2021. The first battery arrived in 2021. The second battery arrived with some delay, the 3-4 month delay in the middle of 2022. Since then, no battery has come. 5 batteries were ordered, which means only 2 batteries have come so far. There is one training battery which has come, which is not operational. So there were 5 operational batteries with 1 training battery. So 2 operational batteries and 1 training battery have come, and 3 operational batteries are yet to come. And this delay seems to be now never ending because the Russians are using a lot of this equipment themselves. If you've seen videos coming out of the Ukraine war from OSINT channels, open source intelligence channels, you will see that quite a few of these S-400 batteries, particularly in Crimea, had been hit by long-range Ukrainian missiles or long-range artillery. So the Russians are consuming quite a bit of it themselves, and that's one of the reasons they are not able to keep up the supplies to India. And that's a source of real concern in India because these 5 S-400 batteries are critical to India's larger long-range air defense. Now, what is a battery? What is an S-400 battery? So I consulted Snehesh Alex Philip, our defense editor, and here are the details. Each battery has 8 battalions. Don't confuse it with battalion of troops in infantry. What is called a battalion in an S-400 battery actually is a group of 8 launchers. Each launcher has 4 tubes. You see these tubes like this, you see this picture. So each launcher has 4 tubes, which means each battalion has 8 into 4, 32 tubes. Each tube can launch a missile, and these tubes can they can be loaded with different kinds of missiles, 4 different kinds of missiles. 400 kilometer range, 250 kilometer range, 120 kilometer range, and 40 kilometer range. How many missiles have come with these batteries? And these tubes and these launchers, that we don't know. I presume that is classified as it should be. The fact that we know is that of the 5 batteries which should have come by the end of 2023, even after the initial delays, only 2 have come, and right now there is no visibility as to when the rest might come, and that's a real crisis for India's larger, deeper, longer range air defense.